There's a new kid on the block wanting to topple the Scarp 1 from its throne as king as the lightweight one person 4-season tents. This is the Vern 1 from Nortent. This is not just a tent, this is a Nortent. In this video I'm going to be doing a full comparison of stats. I didn't want to do just a first impressions video because for me this is direct comparison, having had good use out of the Scarp 1 and enjoyed it in all conditions. But let's first have the Vern 1's moment of glory, that first pitching, and we're going to go on to do a desktop stats comparison of size, weight, and then in this pitch we'll talk about materials, internal and external features, ventilation, space to weight ratio, features, price, availability, and quality of construction. Probably not in that order. Tent up. So before we get on with the stats, a quick unboxing. That's it, unboxed. So I want to thank Nortent for sending me this tent. I was extremely impressed with the Vern 2. I'm going to continue to use it, and I'm really honoured that they sent me this one as well. And this again, I'm really excited about. It promises to be excellent. So let's get on with the stats. Thanks, Nortent. Incidentally, this arrived within 24 hours. So the Nortent Vern 1 arrives with the book of tents, which is all about their products and their story. Quite a good read. And then there's a lovely little silky brochure that talks about seam sealing, how to clear condensation, the fight against condensation, tent care, and then pitching instructions. There's this package and separately the crossing poles. Let's do some comparisons. Length of the Nortent, including the crossing poles, is 42 centimeters. The Scarp 1 is 48 centimeters. The diameter of the Nortent, including the crossing poles, is 16 centimeters, and the Scarp is also 16 centimeters. The Nortent total weight, pegs and crossing pole, is 2.138 grams. Scarp is 2.116, so within a tuppence worth of weight, the same. The Vern 1 without the crossing poles that you might not always need because they're strictly for foul weather is 1.836, and the Scarp is 1.661. So a small win there for the Scarp because of course that has two crossing poles. Minimum length for the Nortent is down to 40 because the end poles are slightly smaller. The Scarp without the main poles in there, still 48, won't really go any smaller. That's the size of those end carbon fibre poles. We'll have a little bit look what's included with the Nortent. So there's the main tent itself. Just has a couple of nice clips around there. Lovely silky bag, and in here there's a small repair kit, just like there was with the Vern 2, and this includes some fabric, some seam sealer, a brush, and a pole repair sleeve. That just goes in there. The Nortent comes with 14 of these pegs that weigh in total 225 grams, and they're a Y section with this kind of fluting at the ends. Really makes it quite tough. They can be a little bit painful, these pegs, as you put them in, and
a thin bit of 2mm Dyneema, one nicely tied with reflective on it, and each peg weighs 17 grams. The Scarp originally comes with the Eastern pegs, excellent pegs, which weigh 14 grams, but I've added some elk kit long nails and they come to 248 grams in total. But my preference overall would be for these Eastern ones, but you'd have to add more. The elk kit ones are slightly heavier, and I don't recall them actually coming with the poles on. So despite the Nortent also needing to be seam sealed, I would say the state of preparedness with enough pegs and sufficient guys with a little repair kit would go to the Nortent in terms of field ready. Okay, let's get back to being in the field, and we'll pitch the tents and have a look at outer and inner dimensions. And for those that like it, I'm going to put on the screen now some screenshots of the exterior dimensions and something about the materials, in case I forget when we're in the field.
Fairly plain Jane bag. There's a repair kit inside there. That's the main pole. This is labelled crossing pole and pegs. Comes with a couple of retention buckles in case you didn't want to take the bag. This is a single pole tent with one 9mm 7000 series aluminium tent, just like the Scarp one, but the Scarp one uses an Eastern pole. This is one that Nortent say is specially sourced. And there's a captive end for the pole here, which is round the other side. So the captive end is at the door end, and this captive end is a really tough material, and the sleeve is made out of a heavy duty material, unlike the Scarp one. As ever, my friends, you get to go in first. That new tent feeling. Clip at the bottom of the door. In we go. It's a nice big porch. Second impressions, it's wide, a little bit lower than what I've been used to, but the inner tent is a much thicker material than the Scarp one. Right, after you. Nice. A little bit tidying up to do here to improve the pitch, but I think what I'll do is get the Scarp one up. You don't need to see that quick, and we'll do more into this comparison. What are your feelings about stealth in this wood and meadow scene here? Let's have a little talk about external features. I think my first impression is that it's somewhat easier to get a tauter pitch along its full length. The Vern 1 relies heavily on this triangle system here, the single aluminium pole at the end that you pitch at a bit of an angle here. There is a lot of tension on this point, but it's heavily reinforced with Dyneema cloth. Of course, this is a big area, but it's kind of like nicely scooped, and there's good tension in that seam, and there's additional guying points down here. So structurally wise, looks nice. It's single pole, but there's definitely space to put a second pole, and at the other end, in the captured end, there's space for a second pole. And what could be easier than to thread another cup through this little peg sleeve here and have a second cup there and double pole the tent? That would be awesome. Of course, there is the option to attach another guy line or two here, and that's something I've done with the Vern 2 recently to add stability. And this Velcro is intended for the crossing pole, but it's definitely robust enough to guy from. So I will ask Nortent if they'll send me a second pole. It might not be in their modus operandi with this tent, but absolutely worth trying, and that would make it a serious competitor to the double poling abilities of the likes of Hilleberg. But you could argue that it doesn't need it. So the guy points have got this Dyneema cloth, 2mm Dyneema lines, which again are nice and stealthy, but I have found that they're a bit trip prone, being so very discreet. With the Scarp, we've got this super strong structure at the end, but it's well known that it's not that easy to get tension in this part. But we've got the central guide point, but you'll see a lot of people use a trekking pole to get this a little higher and a bit of a pull out from the inner, because it does tend to sag and hit the inner tent. This is definitely single pole sleeve only. It's a reinforced sill nylon, but can be prone to puncturing, and the attachment points for the guy lines there are just stitched in to the seam. Doesn't come with these guy lines. I had to put them on as an aftermarket thing, and of course, as I've mentioned, it's just a little nylon cup. So overall, first impressions on the outside is that the Vern 1 has superior construction materials and a little bit more thought to the key points. And there's been some controversy recently with the Scarp 1 failing on a wild camp. I think it's been a little bit blown out of all proportion, and this has been proven again and again to be a really storm-worthy tent by me personally. And the Vern 1 is untested so far. But in terms of, I'm sure it's not untested, but it's not popularly known how good its storm-worthy features on. But in terms of construction and quality of materials, it ticks all the boxes. So let's talk about materials. So Nortent specify a 20 denier outer, and Scarp go for 30 denier. The inner tent on the Vern is much heavier at 30 denier, and the floor is 40 denier with no seams in the middle. The inner tent of the Scarp is a Whisper Light 10 denier, and the floor is also 30 denier, again with no seam down the middle. So both of these are siliconized nylon. Neither of them come with tape seams, and both of them do require seam sealing. One more seam on the outside here that'll require a tiny bit more work, but I have seen here The Nortent is nicely sealed up in the side here on the inner, and I did have problems with the Scarp because the bathtub also required seam sealing, and certainly in the corners in mine, in the seams, there was actually large stitch holes, so I had to do kind of 2 or 3 layers and test it with a hose to make sure that that was kind of working. Incidentally, if there's anything I've missed out here, have a look at Andrew Park. His first impressions video, absolutely excellent. Right, let's have a look at vestibules. Now, what I want to be able to do, if it's lashing down of rain or snow, is to be able to get in this tent and, without getting in the inner, get dry and take my waterproofs off. There's certainly adequate room to do that in here. Excellent for a one-man tent. I could take my over trousers off and then plop myself into the inner tent without getting in the inner tent wet. Now, with the Scarp in this format, I'm going to struggle to do that, of course, but it's well known that you can slide this back. I often struggle to do this because these tapes are so flimsy that they often kind of like twist and get a little jammed, in my experience. That's got that there now, so I could push that back, and then I should maybe have space to just squeeze inside there and get my jacket off. It's just about manageable, but no air is easy. There's a lot less headspace in this vestibule area. I could manage it, but it would be a struggle. Of course, the trick up the sleeve with the Scarp 1 is it's got the same size vestibule on the other side, so I could put my rucksack in there first and get my jacket off here. In terms of storm protection, the Vern 1 only has doors to one side, but there is 2 doors. Presumably you're going to pitch the tent end into wind, and if the wind changes direction, you've got the option to use either door. With the Scarp, you've got the option to use the door either side, but they're both facing in the same direction. So if the wind was to radically shift and come from this direction, you would have the wind and weather coming in, but in my experience that's kind of like generally not a problem. But in nice weather, with the ability to let the sunshine in and get this open, the Vern 1 is a clear winner there. But hang on a second, watch this. Push that back. So if you wanted to pitch facing this way into the sunrise and watch the sun come up, you would have a vast panorama there. That would be absolutely awesome in fair weather. And of course you've still got a sheltered area to cook under if you had kind of like modest weather coming down. The door inside is still dry. Scarp 1 with its smaller doors is held back by this Velcro. It's a little bit fiddly, but it works. And I did the aftermarket alteration myself of putting a toggle and loop on the door, because as previously it was just the elastic. Well worth doing that little mod. So in the Scarp here, I can see out pretty nicely. It's just not that vast panorama that we've got with the Vern. Let's talk about ventilation. Now, either side of the Vern 1, these are strong mesh panels, and these are vents at the top of the double door here, and the mesh panel is accessible from the inside. Let's have a look. The top here, it's a wire protected hood, so you can get both of those open, but of course, unlike the Scarp 1, you haven't got that at the opposite end, so perhaps through air in this direction wouldn't be as good, but this is creating quite a little through vent here, which will be good for clearing vestibule condensation. At the end of the Vern 1 inside there's the small vent, and what I've already done is undone this and accessed it from inside and tucked away the little storm flap, which just goes into toggles at the bottom. It's doable, but with one hand just reaching through in there, but it's a bit of a low space in here, and I would suggest that you would need some practice at this. And it's right, that end was a lot easier to do without the camera, and I've just left that open to get some through draft. Let's have a look at the Scarp 1 ventilation. I'm just going to be brief with this because it's well known. With the Scarp on the end here, you can undo this bottom zip and you clip it over there. That tends to stay up, let some air in there. Of course, that solid inner tent in there, you can't do that from the outside. Now on the inner tent, the Scarp 1 just has a mesh panel at the top that you can't close off, but of course it does have a double zip to allow air from there, but that's a very small area there, not as big as the Vern 1, which is pretty much double the size of that. And of course the Scarp 1 has the trick up its sleeve of you being able to pull this up and lift up the hole at the bottom. So with a little bit of planning, the Scarp 1 ventilation is superior really for warm weather. I've not tested this yet, but you can see the size of that vent there. It's absolutely massive. The Vern has got a double tie back here, so there's no danger of the door dropping down annoyingly. And this door reminds me of the Abisko 1 Lite. So if we're talking about tent comparison, I'll put a link below. Please check out my single hoop tent A-list, and that was up against the Hilleberg Acto, the Fall Raven Abisko 1, an offering from Robins, and of course the Scarp 1. And in that test for me, maybe with a little bit of bias, the Scarp 1 was the winner, but of course this tent wasn't around then. So a link below to that. So a nice thing here is the whole of the door is a heavy duty mesh. This feels very robust, doesn't let a lot of air through with it being so dense, but it's certainly going to last the distance. In terms of space, that's a standard Cedar Summit Etherlite XT mat. I shove that up to one end, there's over a metre of available space there. If I do the same there, there's a massive amount of space. So you would definitely be able to fit yourself and a large rucksack at the end there, but more importantly for me, at the side is there space for the dog? The answer is yes, of course. If the answer had been no, the tent had been going straight back to Nortent, wouldn't it, honey? But we're okay. She's in. Get myself in now. I'm 6'1" and I've just got space to sit up there, but that's adequate. That's fine. If I do the drink test, that's manageable if I press the bottle up against the inside of the tent, but just manageable. I would like 5 centimeters more, but you know, that's absolutely fine and perfectly livable. So with me lying down there, there's space for my feet, space for the dug, and there's space for my head. That's about a big hand width above my head. And of course there's still masses of space at the top there. So yeah, that's fine. In terms of internal pockets, I've got 2 here, I've got 1 here and 1 over here. So which either end I'm lying, they'll be accessible, and there's a hook here. So that feels kind of really nice and livable. In the vestibule, I've got the rucksack there and my shoes at that end, and when that door's shut, there'll be more than adequate height and space to cook. But of course, real world is what's important. So I'm going to be using this on several wild camps in the upcoming months. But importantly, keep an eye out on my tent review and wild camping playlist. And please subscribe so you won't miss out on anything. Because in about a month's time, I'm going to be doing a 2-night, 2-person trip into the Lake District. And we're going to be taking the Scarp one and the Vern one. So the person that's using or coming with me has never used either tent, and we're going to swap over on the second night. So you'll get my experience perspective, albeit only having used the Vern one once or twice, but a considerable amount in the Scarp one, and the other person will be having a non-tent fanatic perspective of what it's like to live and use both tents. And he's a big lad. You would have seen him before, my 6'2" strapping lad Josh. So it'll be interesting to get his perspective. Well, everybody knows that famous Scarp one 1.5 person space, and it feels a little bit easier to be in here, slightly less claustrophobic, but the features are lacking. There's no pockets at that end, so if I'd pitched and wanted to be at this end, there'd be nothing there. And of course, there's just one very small pocket at each end. There's a couple of toggles at the top to make a drying loop, but the width is slightly less, I think. I'll put the dimensions up, and the length is definitely significantly less, but the length is more than adequate. So in terms of living comfort, I would suggest the Scarp one does have more move about space in there. The distance from my nose is about similar, but I also do know from experience that this tends to bow in a little bit here, cutting into your space a little bit. So in terms of inner tent space, the Scarp one is the winner there, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's more livable. Certainly the vestibule space, if you're talking about one big one, and that's pulled back there, is significantly bigger on the Vern one, because in this configuration there now, the Scarp one second vestibule space is very small. The second vestibule space is very small, and you would have space for your rucksack empty, shoved up on its side, and space for your boots on line. So it's kind of like an extra bit of gear area, whereas this would be just your cooking area, and in the Vern one you'd do all that in one spot. In terms of internal height, pretty similar there really. I think the Scarp has it just a tiny bit. So let's talk about value for money. The Vern one retails for $400, which is £315 at today's rate, and the Scarp is currently at $500, and for both that includes the crossing poles, and I think that comes to $380 odd. And of course both of these tents will have VAT at 20% and customs and excise duty. So roughly you're going to be paying about £100 less for the Vern one. So in your tent store, this is going to cost you around £400, and the Scarp will be approaching more like £500. So I feel in this context the Vern 1 represents really good value for money in terms of quality of construction. So this has just been a very quick run through. I'm not too popular doing this. We're flying off on a family holiday this afternoon and I've sneaked out to do this because I was absolutely itching to have a look at the tent. I'm sure they won't mind. It'll scratch that itch whilst we're away, because I really wanted to have a look at it. I've not put the crossing pole on. We'll save that for another time, for another wild camp. It's just a single crossing pole on the Vern 1 that comes through here, and a double crossing pole on the Scarp 2, a better reinforced thread through point here, and of course you don't have to thread it through, you can undo it, whereas the Scarp you just have to thread it through. No failure point. So let me know in the comments below what you think. Which one would you buy? And is it time for me to sell the Scarp 1? Well, possibly. We'll find out over the next few weeks and months. So thanks very much for watching. I better get these tents down, get back to the family. It's starting to rain a little bit, so I'll have to dry them out as well. But no bother. I've enjoyed this little session and this opportunity to have a look at the Vern 1 close up, and it looks cool. Thanks a lot.